Let's go.
Let's go. Oh, no.
Do you want to?
Sorry. I'll let you.
Next one. I'm excited and I feel relaxed and I'm ready to party. Don't say sorry. You don't need to do that. You don't need to apologize. It's a fucked up female habit. You don't need to be sorry for anything ever.
Can you guess what every woman's worst nightmare is?
I don't have rage issues!
I have nothing to prove to you.
When I'm good, I'm very good. But when I'm bad, I'm better.
I say when it comes to stardom and Lauren, there are no accidents.
Hi, Karen Peterson.
Hello and welcome to Citizen Dame, where it is Pride Month and we are ready to celebrate. I'm Karen Peterson, joined as always by Lauren Humphries Brooks.
Hello. Woo! Pride Month. Yay!
Hello,
with an appropriate topic this time.
I mean, Psycho was appropriate when you're talking about stars, and we didn't really get into all that, I think, last week, but
No, we didn't. I think we're going to talk a little bit more about it this week, actually, because there's stuff to be said on that level. Definitely.
That is true.
I am good. How are you, Karen?
I'm doing fine. We'll just go with that and pretend it's true.
All right.
No, for anybody who is listening, who's like, oh no, what's wrong? No, I was at a conference all week and I'm exhausted. I really am fine. I need a nap. Really, really bad. So anyway, all right. So anything new happening in your neighborhood?
No, it's nice. Finally, we have nice weather and it's gorgeous again. Like having a very nice time. My dog is very happy to get to be the fun police of the neighborhood once again. No parties, no talking outside, no laughter. Like he got very upset that my neighbor kind of diagonal from me was having it wasn't really a party. It was like a few people on their balcony basically, and he was like, no, absolutely not.
I did not approve this fun.
Yeah, my dog is very much the fun police. Like I've talked to him about it. It's just like, bro, you can't just police the neighborhood. It's not nice.
That's so funny. Oh man. Meanwhile, my bunny just stares at me like, this it? That's all you got?
So your bunny is just very judgmental.
He is extremely judgmental and I love him for it. All right. Well, as you mentioned, and as you already know, because you're all very smart people, it is Pride Month. It is June. It is Pride Month. And we are very excited today to talk about a couple of documentaries, a couple of, I think, pretty important documentaries about trans experience, trans people on screen. And so today we're talking about the 1990 documentary Paris is Burning and also the 2020 documentary Disclosure. So we're just gonna dive right in. So Paris is Burning was it was directed by Jennie Livingston. This, like I said, it came out in 1990, but this followed 7 years. It followed some participants for 7 years. So this is over the course of quite a while and really gets into the lives and experiences of several trans people, men and women, who participate in these balls, these big events, and sort of very early acceptance of drag. What's the word I'm looking for? It's like these drag competitions and things.
Yeah,
and
it's ballroom culture from
right.
the 1980s, and it's something that had been going on for a very long time, actually, in various forms, but particularly in the 80s, you get kind of this new generation of this is my understanding. Again, I was not alive then. I was not a participant in ball culture or anything like that. But it's the kind of thing that's been going on for a very long time, and then it turns into these kind of increasingly elaborate drag competitions. And drag parties, kind of it's interesting. The film really depicts the competition element and sort of the beauty pageant almost element of it, but also just you get people voguing, going onto the floor and like battling it out with like posing and stuff like that. It's really interesting.
Yeah. And of course the 1980s in New York, I mean, this was the AIDS epidemic was raging, and homophobia was raging, transphobia, so you have so many things that are happening through these people's experience, and the film does deal with some of that and does deal with the way that people are treated in and outside of their community. But to me, I think the biggest thing about it is this celebration of beauty, and of people getting to be free when they get to take on these personas and they get to participate in these big events. To me, I think that's the most beautiful thing about this doc. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I agree. It's this, because you're talking about a representation also of a community. This is a very liminal community. Like, these are very poor people a lot of the time, or people that have been, there's a whole conversation throughout the film about basically people that have been rejected by their families, right? And have wound up in New York, for various reasons and in various forms. All of them are very young. I mean, you talk about like some of the mothers and the fathers of the houses, the different house groups. And then they're like 25 years old, right? Yeah. And they've got kids who are 16, 17, right? But it's just like, but they're the elders, right? They're the adults in this scenario. But that's one of the things that kept on coming home to me, especially in this rewatch, because I'd seen this film before, was how this is such a space of freedom for people who don't have a lot of freedom, and who have been kind of rejected and cast aside and ignored and demonized. Also, this height of the AIDS crisis, and treated like as these lepers. I don't know. So like people who just are not allowed to exist in straight mainstream society, and finding this culture and this connection in this society with people who are like them, and actually finding acceptance there. So building these families, having these parents who are going to take care of you and look after you and try to help you navigate this space that is very is frightening, is dangerous, but it's also really joyful at the same time. And I really liked that. I liked the whole discussion of found families and how honest everybody was about it as well.
Yeah. And so I think it's really eye-opening, especially because yes, this is 30 plus years ago that this came out, and this is 40 years ago that people started participating in it. And a lot of these folks weren't even still alive when the movie was originally, when the documentary was originally released, and many of them by now are no longer with us. But getting to focus on their enjoyment of life, and the fact that they got to find a space where they could live and be who they were. And it feels like a celebration, even while there is this this constant sort of in the background feeling of sadness and a little bit of dread sometimes too, because you just kind of know, oh, this isn't going to work out for this person, but it's really about just highlighting this culture that so many people didn't know about, but that was becoming a much more open and a much more accepted thing, I guess. But
you can see how it turns into, and even over the course of the documentary, right? You see, like, so this whole thing about voguing, and of course immediately I was like, oh, Madonna, right? Vogue, right? And like I know about that, but of course she picked it up from Street Queens, like this is where this comes from, and how that. And then also those performances and some of the things, so just some of the language, etc., that then we know from something that is, so heavily produced, like RuPaul's Drag Race. Yeah. And also the fact that, how it's one of those times where you're just like, yeah, this has been kind of absorbed into mainstream culture, and in that way by straight culture. So it's being observed by straight people. And what I like about Paris is Burning is that it brings us back to, and it reminds us of, this is where this came from. This was not about Madonna, right? Madonna didn't come up with this shit. And that's really important to recognize and to understand, because so often those things do come from and we're not just talking about queer culture, talking about trans culture, and primarily Black trans people, and Black drag queens, and very like people who are and have been forced onto the extreme margins of society and are helping each other to exist within that. And now it's kind of been sanitized, it's been made palatable, it's been like, oh, we're going to be entertained by these people. But Paris is Burning is much more about, this is who these people are. This is where all of this comes from. Yeah. And it has its flaws, definitely. I think we'll talk about that, but I think it's a good reminder. And the fact that the documentary continues to be talked about and watched, yes, the film came out in 1990, is so important, because it keeps on bringing you back to like, this is where this comes from. This was not invented by rich people or by white people.
Right. Yeah. Well, and just by the way, as an aside, Pose, which was a TV series on FX, an Emmy award-winning TV series on FX, was very directly inspired by Paris is Burning. That's it gets into the houses and the competition and all the drama behind the scenes and all that. It's a great series. If you haven't watched it, it's just 3 seasons, I think just 3. But really a fantastic show. So let's talk a little bit about, well, one question I had for you is, this did come out in 1990, and there have been, over the decades, there have been more and more series and more stars that have really kind of made not just trans culture, but drag queen specifically, part of the mainstream. And then, of course, now in the last couple of years, we've really seen an attack on drag culture, specifically, as certain states have tried to just outright ban them, and certainly don't want them around the children. But why is it that you think Paris is Burning, which is part of the Criterion Collection, has endured so well?
I think, first of all, it's a really well-made film. Like it introduces us to these, to like a lot of different people, but you feel connected to them there. I was actually thinking about this earlier, about the representation of queer people generally in media, and how so often, particularly queer men, particularly drag queens, really flamboyantly gay men, are represented as these extremes, right? And because there is an extremity to it, obviously, you watch these people putting on their makeup and everything, there's an extremity to drag, and that's what it is, right? It's supposed to be, it's an emphasis, and one of the but one of the things that I think Paris is Burning does is that, again, it's that kind of reminder of like real people underneath all that. It isn't all performance. It's a kind of performance, and it's a kind of art, and it is also a form of self-expression, etc. But these are real, complicated human beings who live real complicated lives, not just lives of suffering, right? And that's another thing that I think comes up a lot in talking about queer stories. It's just like it's again that kind of attitude, almost of, I hate using the word, but like almost of slumming it. It's like, oh, let's look in on the people, on the liminal people who are going to die horribly and all of that shit. And there's so much emphasis on suffering, but Paris is Burning does not emphasize suffering at all. And without, like, it doesn't ignore it. It builds it into this entire culture that is about this complicated and interesting and funny and human group of people. And so I think that that's one of the reasons why it endures so well. It's just a really well-made film. And it's a film that shows us humanity in a space where, particularly in the 90s, but even now, where we still don't treat people as having humanity. There's still the other. There's still that attitude, and we still, I think, see that, you know, even in with all the progress that has been made, even in stuff like RuPaul's Drag Race, where it's still entertainment for the straight people. And, you know, looking in on a culture and looking in on a kind of performance that is fun to look at, maybe, but doesn't give us the depth of humanity, of the realness, you know, even to borrow a term from the film, the realness of drag queens, of trans people, of queer people generally. They're not simply there to entertain. This is a life. These are people with real lives. And so I think that's why it continues to sort of speak to us. And also the fact that things have changed, but they haven't changed that much.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, I think, a very big issue as well. It's amazing how much of the rhetoric and conversation that's going on in Paris is Burning and in other queer documentaries is still taking place right now. We're still having the same fucking fights. Yeah. And that's so it's important to note that we're still having the same fights.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and that's something that you and I have talked about a lot on this podcast, is people don't change. Like, individuals can change, but people as a whole don't. Like, progress is very, very slow, and ultimately humans are humans, you know, and the things that we do, even when the conversations shift or the topics are different, the way that we handle things stays basically the same. There's always going to be someone that we are terrible to as a society. There's always going to be people who are on the margins and people who are not accepted. And in the case of trans people and drag queens specifically too, and that's a fight that's been going on for years and years and years, and it will continue to even as more people in our society do accept trans people. There's always going to be some that don't, and I think one of the things about Paris is Burning and why it's still relevant now and why it's important still for people to watch it is to have that kind of in your face reminder that we still have not come as far as we need to, in accepting people just for who they are and allowing people to just live their lives.
Yeah, and it comes into like that question, and I think disclosure also gets into this, and actually another documentary that I watched this week just because it was on the list, and I was like, oh, I'll watch this as well. The Times of Harvey Milk, which actually came out, is about events prior to 1984, but came out in 1984, and so it's interesting because it's happening fairly, like, it's coming out fairly close to the time that Paris is Burning is being filmed. So it's this interesting sort of like trajectory going on. But again, this whole question of acceptance within the mainstream and the conflict between assimilation, which is a conversation that is very big within the queer community, you know, assimilating into straight culture, mainstream culture, right? And making it safe, palatable, etc. Some of the conversations that have been had around pride parades and what pride actually means. You know, there's all kinds of stuff. There's a whole debate about kink at pride. And this whole thing about like making queerness and gayness and transness, etc., comfortable for the people outside. And when you're looking at Paris is Burning, you're also talking about not just gayness and transness, but also race and class. And so I'm trying to remember, I think it was one of the people that is interviewed in Paris is Burning mentions that, like, oh, I'm not just, you know, you've got like 3 strikes against me. I'm Black, I'm gay, and I'm a drag queen. Like, it's all 3 of them. But it's just like, you know, you're as liminal as you possibly can be, essentially, within American society. But then the question becomes like, how far do you know, are you asking people to assimilate? Do you want people to assimilate? And so again, it goes back to some of those questions about some more of the queer centric shows like RuPaul or Queer Eye for the Straight Guy, and which, you know, I remember that the original series started, and there was all this conversation about like what this meant and how did this reinforce stereotypes, etc. but like all of that kind of becoming like a broader part of this. And so again, going back to something like Paris is Burning and recognizing that, you know, you want there's that combination of acceptance, tolerance, and what then turns into assimilation and changing people and forcing them to change, forcing them to be palatable to the mainstream, and how you even go about that and whether or not that's even desirable. I don't know. That was a lot of rambling. Sorry.
No, it was not rambling.
I've been thinking a lot about stuff, man.
That's good. That's good. Yeah.
So what about you? What do you think?
I don't even remember the question.
I don't know the question either. Okay, there's something that I wanted to mention also. This whole thing about like gender being drag. Yeah. And one of the things that happens in Paris is Burning is that there's a category about passing, basically realness, being able to pass as being a gay man able to pass as a woman, but also being able to pass as straight.
Right.
Like, and I found that really interesting. It was again something that I didn't really pay attention to the first time I saw it, of like this actually being a drag category, right? That like how well can you pass as what straight society says you're supposed to be, which is this very masculine man or this very feminine woman, right? This is what you are. Can you pass?
When they get into the big argument over the fur coat being buttoned, like that's a woman's coat because it's buttoned on the wrong side. I love that. And it's one of those moments where it's funny to watch it, but also like, first of all, they're dead serious. Second of all, it actually is a competition and they are taking that seriously as a competition. It's partly they're judging each other, but also they're judging each other because it's a competition. So yeah, it's a good moment. But yeah, it's really interesting. I think that we already talked about how we really like that this is a celebration of beauty, but I think it also ultimately just really, as a whole, it's very eye-opening to an entire world that I would never have known anything about because yeah, like when you're watching RuPaul, and getting into, you know, who's going to win Drag Race or whatever, there's so much other stuff that you don't know about, that they don't really take the time to get into because that's not what their show is about. And just this entire kind of ecosystem of and all these categories of what drag really means. And, you know, and in Paris is Burning, it gets into how for some people, they want gender affirmation. They call it something different at the time, but they want that surgery. And other people are like, no, that's not what I'm in this for. And so I think seeing there's not, I think one of the most important points this makes, and also we'll get into this with disclosure too, is there's not just one way to experience being trans. There's not just one way to experience being a drag queen or even just, you know, being LGBTQ, whatever part of that spectrum you fall into. There are so many ways to experience that. And there's so many types of people. And I think ultimately that's one of the things that really resonates with me, or to me, for all kinds of documentaries and stories that highlight parts of these cultures and experiences that I don't know, is this reminder that there's not just one way to experience it. And there's not one way to be trans or gay or whatever it may be.
Or male or female or non-binary, right? Like, I think that's part of it, like that whole idea about passing and about realness, right? Being judged on how well do you come off. Like, could you walk down the street and everybody would be like, oh yeah, that's a street thug or a soldier, right? And and that's a really interesting thing to like it's this interesting almost reversal, right? Of
Mm-hmm.
like, okay, we're now going to loop right back around to basically saying that gender is drag, right? Gender performance, all of it is drag, because the clothes that you put on and the way that you walk and the way that you carry yourself is a drag performance, is just you're pretending at some level. How much does it express who you are, and how much is it like trying on, and it's not necessarily negative, but it's trying on different personas.
Yeah.
And seeing what is expressive of the person that you are and the gender that you are, and then you get into people who feel differently depending upon the day, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting then to see it being talked about in kind of those terms this early, and being like not just something that's talked about, but something that is a part of a drag competition.
Yeah.
There's one other thing. The other thing I just wanted to ask about with Paris is Burning is that there's a lot of talk about like, it's because it's particularly about what femininity means, because a lot of it is focused on trans women and drag queens, dressing up as women or dressing up as a version, I guess, of femininity. And there are a couple of particularly some of the younger women talking about wanting to be like the models, idolizing the models, wanting to become models and actresses. And there's always this like tension, I think, between like what does femininity look like and what does femininity mean. And I think I want to say this, like Pepper LaBeija, who mentions that some of these young people, they think that they think they're just going to become women and it's all going to be great, but women don't have it easy.
Right.
And so that's their point, like of like, I don't want to be a woman.
Mm-hmm.
but it's not this like, I don't want to be a woman because women are bad or something like that, or it would be terrible to be a woman, but more like, that's not going to make my life better necessarily.
Right.
And to imagine that just becoming this model, becoming Christy Brinkley or whoever, is going to like give you the things that you're longing for is false, right? And I found that really interesting as well, that tension about like what gender performance is and what it means to be female and to be perceived as female within mainstream culture.
Yeah. I do also though wonder, would like people who are very much, I don't want that because that's also not safe, would they still feel that way now? I mean, I don't think it's much safer now, but it's more accepted. So it's one of those things. Is this partly because of the time period? Would they change their minds if they were talking about this today, or not? I mean, obviously I don't know. I don't think we can ask them, but
well, it's one of those questions, because there are drag queens that are gay men that identify as men, etc. And there are drag queens who are trans. Mm-hmm. And it's the same thing with drag kings and trans men, etc. So like we tend to conflate them, especially now.
Right.
But it should be noted that like, being a drag queen does not mean that you're trans, and being trans does not mean you're a drag queen.
Right. That's absolutely true. And also it comes back to, what we were talking about a bit ago, where there's also, even within that, even if you are a drag queen and trans, that does not also mean that you want to,
have surgery. Yeah.
Right. It doesn't mean that you want to have the surgery. The way people identify their sexual orientation, there's so many, there's such a wide spectrum of experiences. And I think that's one of the things that really I liked about Paris is Burning, is that it does take the time. Jennie Livingston took the time to actually get into some of those differences, to show that there's not just one answer,
Well, it also highlights that none of these people are going into this as like naive or not understanding their own sexuality or their own gender or anything. They're exploring it, some of them, or they're learning about it, but they're very confident in who they are. And recognize fully that they are not and cannot be accepted by the broader world, even though, and some of the stories that they tell about, like their parents chasing them out, their parents like throwing them out when they're sometimes when they're children, when they're like 14 or 15 years old, because they put on a dress, or the parents that are somewhat accepting but also aren't, like well, I'm not going to throw you out, but also I'm going to burn your clothes. Like all of that. It's very clear about like them understanding both who they are and what that means, and what a struggle that means and what it means for others as well. Like I'm trying to remember the name of the woman talking about the one daughter who gets killed, and talking about like, well, that's, she's very sad about it, which is also that's the life of, it's not surprising, that's the life of a gay street hustler in New York City, and it's really sad. Like it's not, oh whatever, it's very like, I don't like it, but I'm not surprised by it.
I don't have children, I'm not a mother, but when I hear stories of the way families treat their kids over their identity, I don't understand it. I do not understand how a parent can just turn their back on their child like that.
Or to make it conditional, right? To say like, well, you can stay, but only if you pretend to be a boy, right? Only if you continue to behave as my son.
Only if you act in the way that I see as fitting and appropriate.
I'm not a mother either, but I cannot imagine saying that to my child, even thinking it, like being like, oh no, my love is conditional for you. It's conditional on how you perform and how you behave, and like, you don't embarrass me, all of that shit. Like, dear God, how can you say that you love your kid and do that? Right.
Any final thoughts on Paris is Burning?
It's a good film. It's a really good film. It does have issues, but it really should be watched. Like, if you haven't seen it, it's funny, it's sweet, it's very moving. Like it can be sad, but it's also incredibly joyful, and I like just how it's balanced.
We will get into a couple of issues as we talk about our next film, which came out 30 years later, and that was Disclosure, which is available on Netflix. This is a documentary. This is one of those talking head documentaries, but it's a really in-depth look at transgender people in Hollywood and their experiences. So we get to hear from actors, actresses, directors, filmmakers, writers, about their thoughts and also their experiences being trans in Hollywood. And so this was your first time watching it?
It was, yes. It was fascinating. I wish I'd seen it earlier.
So what were some of your thoughts? I know there are many. Well, just give me a couple and we'll break them down.
I'm just gonna ramble on again. It is a very well made film. It is talking head, but I think that it balances that out. First of all, it's almost, I think it's exclusively trans people.
Yes.
I can't think of anyone who is cis in that conversation. I don't even so which is unusual. We don't see that a lot. So it's not just like one trans person giving one commentary. And actually, that's one of the things that I liked, was that you get several different perspectives on different films and pieces of media. That kind of highlights, that first of all, again, trans people are people. They have their own opinions. They're not a monolith. But also their comfort with and willingness to accept certain things. Or willingness to even look at things that are problematic and be like, this is problematic, but also I really like it, like I really enjoy this story. So yes, it's got issues, but I really like it. And I liked that. I liked getting to see those different perspectives and different kind of analysis of films and of scenes and of the way that trans people are represented on screen, because it isn't just about their experiences within the system. It's also about how they saw themselves in media and how we see trans people in media and what that means and what effect that has on our perceptions and on our culture. For me personally, it highlighted a lot of things that I kind of knew, but hadn't thought about in a great deal of depth. And sort of made me also think about, like, yeah, why not just how you perceive trans people, but how you perceive gender generally, and how that gets internalized and it becomes, you know, this source of fear or of humor, and of like how you understand your own gender, and how you respond to kind of, for lack of a better term, gender transgressions in a lot of different forms. So not just transness, but, you know, things that used to be called gender bending, older pieces of media that are kind of more progressive in a certain sense, but less progressive in another. And I think that the film dealt with all of those things in a really in-depth and interesting way that definitely made me think about my own perceptions and my own understanding of the importance of media and the importance of representation.
Yeah. First of all, just to kind of back up for a second. So this was directed by Sam Feder, who is a trans director. And some of the participants include Laverne Cox, Jen Richards, Jans Ford, Susan Stryker, Lily Wachowski. So some recognizable faces, getting to talk about their experiences and getting to talk just about their opinions too, about the films that sort of in some ways helped them understand more about themselves, and in other ways kind of made them feel a little bit more afraid of the road ahead of them. And so hearing their thoughts about it is really eye-opening. Just, you know, like you were saying, I think that some of it is, you know, as a cis woman, some of it is just it introduces a perspective that I hadn't had to consider because it, you know, didn't align with my experiences. So, you know, it's, you don't know what you don't know. And sometimes you just have to have that directly pointed out to you. And I think that in many ways, disclosure does that very well.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit specifically about some of the things that are brought up. And yeah, when we say talking head documentary, I mean, that's just literally what it is. It's people talking to the camera, doing interviews and sharing their thoughts. But there's a lot of archival footage included, and it's not just like it's not boring. I think like talking head documentaries can sometimes get very boring and dry. This is not, you know, and I think that's part of why it's good, is because you're hearing from people who they are experts because this is their experience, but they're also talking about their feelings and their and that I think gets more really into the hope and the damage that can happen with the way people are represented on screen. So there's a bunch of different tropes and different ideas that are brought up. One of the things that I think comes up several times, well, actually, you know what, first, before we go there, so they do talk about the documentary Paris is Burning.
Yeah.
and they talk about how some of the trouble and some of the problems, and this is something you brought up a minute ago. So do you want to talk about some of the inherent issues with Paris is Burning as a documentary?
Well, I think one of the things that seemed to be highlighted particularly, and it's interesting because a lot of the people are like, I love that movie, you know, but here's some problems with it. The number of the people who were featured in Paris is Burning felt that they were being exploited and that they weren't seeing benefit as a result of this documentary, and that it felt like that the filmmaker was coming into their space, telling a story about them and then leaving and not really giving anything to the community as a result of that. And I understand that, especially at like the personal level, right? The personal level of the individuals who experience that. And I think it's an important story in a broad sense, but it sounds like that in a more specific and personal sense, it has major problems. The other thing that I was interested in that they didn't go into a great deal is about this kind of erasure of trans men.
Mm-hmm.
And several of the trans men who were talking in Disclosure talk about the fact that trans men were a part of ballroom culture, but are not featured at all. Definitely not that I can think of in Paris is Burning. If there is a trans man represented at any point, it's very minor, right?
They get shown, but yeah, they're not featured ever.
They're not talked to, like,
Mm-mm.
You don't get that. And part of the broader conversation then about that is the erasure of trans men generally from trans representation conversations, which I think Disclosure gets into in a really interesting way. I was glad that it did. And how that experience differs from trans women but is also dovetailed with trans women at the same time. And I thought that was an interesting thing because I was not aware at all, actually, based on Paris Spring, I was not aware at all that trans men participated in ballroom culture.
Right.
And that they were like a part of that society and a part of that whole thing. And it's like, I would like to see that. I would like to see how that works. I know about drag kings. I know that is like a part of drag, but it is so often in media treated as a minor part that we don't talk about it. Like, it's like this invisible element. And it's like, I want to see that. I want to know more about that. Like, let's talk about that. Why aren't we talking about that? Mm-hmm. And they go into some of the reasons why as well, like the commodification of femininity and how it's easier to sell women than it is to sell men. And cis and trans. And I think that's like, that says something definitely.
Yeah. Well, and that's something that this gets into as well is like some stories that we have about trans people in film, which we still don't have many, but a lot of the ones that we have, it gets into and focuses on the tragedy of it, and how difficult their lives are, which I mean, it can be very difficult, and there's a lot of prejudice still, of course, and a lot of transphobia, but so many, but it's there's this certain sort of like, well, only greenlight movies that make us feel, like so bad for people, or it's rare to get to see ones that actually celebrate and just let people live.
It goes back to some of those things that we've talked about so-called feminist films, films in terms of representation of women. We talk about it in terms of representation of Black people generally, people of color generally. But we've talked about it before, of that there's a sense almost of celebration that thank God I'm not that.
Right.
Yeah. And it comes from a straight white cis male culture. Thank God I'm not a woman. Thank God I'm not gay. Thank God I'm not Black. And it's this lens into, and sometimes very important stories, but it's still this lens into these stories that has an undercurrent of, give it to the mainstream audience. Then we walk out of the theater and we think about how wonderful it is. At some level, you're like, oh, isn't that terrible? You think about how wonderful it is that you don't have to deal with that. And that is bad. That's not good. That is, and the problem is, and they mentioned this a couple of times in the documentary, is not that you're not allowed to tell those stories, but that those are the only stories being told. And one woman mentions the fact that, like, if there were more trans stories, then you could forgive the occasional clumsy representation, the occasional like failure at representation. That would be okay, because it wouldn't be the only representation. And that's the problem. It's the only representation. And we've made a lot of strides, in terms of feminist filmmaking, in terms of focusing on Black characters and people of color, etc. But it's still not there. It's still that like, well, it always has to be it always has to be perfect, and it always has to be like the single film is going to be like, okay, that is transness, that's queerness, that's femininity, whatever.
Yeah.
And it's maddening.
I can't remember who it was now, but one of the actresses that participated in Disclosure talks about booking two guest appearances on two separate medical dramas in the same day. And like it happened so quickly that she didn't realize that the storylines were basically the same. And in both cases, it was like, your hormones are killing you with cancer. And it was just like, what are we doing here? You know?
Yeah, she was laughing about it. She's just like, I would have paid attention if I'd really been like, okay, oh, I'm playing the same character, basically.
Yeah. Yeah. But then there's also, you know, I think one of the things that I think is great about Disclosure is going back to what we were talking about a little bit with Paris is Burning too, where you get this this range of experiences and this range of thoughts and opinions about things. So, for example, the film Boys Don't Cry comes up. Boys Don't Cry from, I think, 1999, directed by Kimberly Pierce, wins Hilary Swank Best Actress for playing a real life person, Brandon Tina, who was horrifically murdered for being trans. And that was in the mid-90s in Nebraska. And this came around the same time as Matthew Shepard was murdered, and in Wyoming. And I think it was fascinating to me watching the conversation about Boys Don't Cry, because you have a couple of trans men talking about how much that film meant to them and how it really, because masculine trans stories are exceptionally rare. You know, we really do. You mentioned this a bit ago too, and we're going to talk about this again in a second, but you know, there's a lot of focus on trans women, but not so much on trans men. And so for Boys Don't Cry, it was this kind of eye-opening moment for them of getting to see themselves on screen, even though it's this really tragic and terrible, you know, terrible story, terrible because of what happened, not because it's told badly. And then you have someone else who says, oh, Boys Don't Cry. Yeah, there we go. Perfect example of, you know, like trans people must suffer. And then you have someone else who, you know, it's just interesting, like that you get all these different experiences. And again, it's a perfect example of how like there's not just one way to experience being trans, and there's not just one way to experience seeing trans people depicted on screen.
Yeah, there's one guy who talks about like the joy, because the film ends horribly, right? But there is actually a representation of joy and of like, this is great, like, you know, getting to go out and drive around and like date girls and doing all of those things. And like that was one of the things that he talked about, is like getting to see that and be like, oh, you can do that. It's like, that's great. And then of course, then you get the ending, just like, but if you do, you're going to get horribly murdered.
Right. Spoiler alert for Boys Don't Cry.
That balance between the two. And again, I think that they don't really talk about this, but I think it comes back to that's why you need more than just that story. And that is something that one of the interviewees talks about, is like, why is this the story that keeps on being told? And that's the problem. It's not that you can't tell it, but it's the only story you're telling,
right?
And it keeps on getting repeated over and over again. And so there's one guy who's like, you know, it was this moment of terror of like, is that going to happen to me? You know, in order to live, you know, and he was talking about that when he saw the film, he was going through, like, he was transitioning at that point, and seeing it and being like, oh my God, like, I don't know. Do I really want to do it? I don't want that. Like, you know, do I really want to do this? And that's horrifying, to be like, oh, the only way, you know, to have this, your own gender expression and to express the person that you are, great, but you will be horribly killed at the end of all of it. and that goes back to some of the things that we've talked about as well with the importance of representation and the importance of seeing yourself on screen, but also how you see yourself on screen. And not being frightened of that, and getting to have that like complexity of narratives that really is important, and that really like it means something to people, it means something to individuals, and it means something to the culture. It means how we perceive people who are trans. Like, you know, if you have a trans child, like you want to be like, I want you to be safe in this world. And if the only representations you have is how unsafe it is, that's scary, that's distressing, that's, you know, destructive.
Right. Yeah. One thing that I do want to touch on here with disclosure, because I think this is important, and this does tie in a little bit to our episode last week when we talked about Psycho. Psycho is a film that there have been some interpretations of it, I guess, maybe that really get away from what Hitchcock is doing with that film. And this documentary goes into that without actually talking about I think it goes into it in the slightly wrong way. And I'm not saying that anybody's interpretations are wrong, or their feelings about anything are wrong. So I think that the thoughts that are shared in disclosure are valid and interesting and eye-opening for me. But I do think that there has been, whether intentionally or by just misunderstanding, I do think that there has been a misinterpretation by a lot of people about Psycho. And also they get into Silence of the Lambs a little bit. And I think that misinterpretation is unfortunate, but I think it also matters. And I think that the fact that they talk about both of those films in this documentary is really important. So I wanted to just spend a minute or two talking about that. Again, I'm not saying that anybody's experience with a film is wrong at all. But I think with Psycho, and this is something that we did talk about when we were having our discussion. But I think in the case of Psycho, there's, if you really watch and really listen to what is happening, especially in the end when they're breaking down kind of this is what happened, it's very clear Norman Bates is not trans. He is not trying to become a woman. He is mentally ill and has adopted his mother's personality because of this very disturbing relationship between he and his mother. And it's really about that relationship, not about him specifically with womanhood or wanting to become a woman or any of that. It's a very different story. And with Silence of the Lambs, which came out in 1991, they make it very clear multiple times that Buffalo Bill is not trans and that this is a very different situation. That, in fact, there's a scene where Anthony Hopkins specifically tells Jodie Foster he wants to be trans, but he's upset because he's not. And so I'm kind of talking a lot here, but I think it's interesting how people use those storylines. They misunderstand those storylines, and then they use those as examples against the trans community. And it kind of rewrites or shapes this wrong and incorrect narrative about what it actually means to be trans.
Yeah, and I think that what the film points out correctly is that broader cultural and social conversation, that the representations in films like Psycho, and Psycho then spawns other films, right? You've got Homicidal, which is an very interesting film, actually, by William Castle. So basically a low budget version of Psycho, but in a very different way. And then you get like films like Brian De Palma's Just to Kill. Silence of the Lambs has a relationship to it as well. You get a number of the Giallo films make direct reference to Psycho. So like you get this kind of the psychosexual elements of the serial killer and the whole idea about like men dressing up as women, right? in order to fulfill some kind of sexual pleasure, right? And it's always represented as being violent and evil and bad, and they're going to kill women, they're going to do all of these things. But Psycho itself is not about that in the same way. Now, we can't talk about Psycho's relationship to femininity, and to the vilification of femininity and what that means, right? But you always have to read that through the character of Norman Bates himself, not just through what the film is presenting. So yeah, it's one of those times that I think it gets kind of papered over. It's just like, oh well, Psycho is like this. Like, well, not really. Not really. If we really go into the subtleties of the film, and it is a surprisingly subtle film, and I think that's why people tend to just you tend to just go like, oh, this is what it's about, and then you move on.
Right.
But once you go into the subtleties of the film, it becomes much more complicated, and you can argue about its issues, but it's not. Saying that Norman Bates is representative of a trans person on screen is just not accurate.
Correct. Right.
To what the film is representing. But it is accurate to the way that it has been treated in the cultural conversation and in the films that it influences. And I think that element is important. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's essential, yeah, to talk about. And this is why I was glad that they brought it up. Because I think that this is something that gets misunderstood by a wider swath of people. And like when they talk about Silence of the Lambs, and one of the actresses who I'm sorry, I don't remember who it was, but one of them is talking about when they were deciding to transition, and that was one of the things a couple of people said to them was like, what, like Buffalo Bill? And it was really kind of devastating to have the only representation that anybody would talk to her about be this psycho killer from this creepy movie.
Yeah. Well, and yeah, that's where it becomes important. It's not so much what the films themselves are actually arguing, because often they're arguing the exact opposite.
Exactly. Yeah.
But it's how people perceive them and the image that is being presented about trans people. Yeah. and about this whole thing. And this is something that they go into as well, about this whole idea about trans women not being women, but being men in dresses.
Right.
Like, and that's something that comes back again and again and again. And that is a very good argument, because our major understanding of transness on screen for a very long time is it is a man in a dress, not a woman, not someone who is understood to be a woman, who lives as a woman, etc., but a man pretending to be a woman. Mm-hmm. And that is still the argument that we get, particularly about trans women constantly. You are not a woman, you are a man. And that is something that has been reinforced in media for so long, and is so much of the representation of who trans women are, that regardless of what the individual piece of media is doing, it has a consistent and detrimental effect.
Yeah.
And yeah.
No, go ahead.
I don't remember what to say. Oh. Sorry. I was like, I don't have to know. I don't. Never mind.
Yeah, but yeah, I think that you're right. I think that that's ultimately why it matters and why it's important to talk about these things. We have to remember that media literacy is not ubiquitous. There's a lot of people who don't understand. And I do think filmmakers need to be aware of the ways that people might misinterpret and misunderstand what they're saying, but I don't think that necessarily means that they need to spell everything out for people either. You shouldn't. No. because there's always going to be someone who misunderstands it. Right.
I think, again, it goes back to the ultimate argument of this film is not that you're not allowed to represent trans people in different ways. It just can't be the only way. And trans people need to be able to tell their stories.
And that is
in their own ways.
Yeah. And that is the biggest key, is when you allow trans people to tell their own stories and to make their own art, there's even then you're still going to have a multiplicity of experiences, but at least it's going to come from an honest place of understanding this experience and not trying to insert themselves into a narrative that is not theirs.
Yeah, and that's the major argument of this film. I think really a lot of it comes down to, and the importance of it.
Mhm.
The other thing that I was thinking about in watching this, because I am chest deep in the Our Flag Means Death fandom, is talking about this is a film that came out in 2020, so this is prior to Our Flag Means Death, and it's also prior to like stuff like Good Omens, which do represent trans, non-binary characters, queer characters as complex individuals, and within the realm of comedy as well. So in which their transness or their non-binariness or their queerness is not the main point of the comedy, is not, they're not token, they're not simply there in order to be like, we've got a trans character now. And so I would be interested to know, honestly, what the conversation would be now, having more and more pieces of media that are trying to represent the gender spectrum generally, the gender and the sexuality spectrum generally, in a much more diverse and depth level way, right? And I mean, going back to this issue of media literacy, that doesn't mean that everyone's going to get it.
Mm-hmm.
But it is producing more and more of these kinds of narratives. It is actually going on this trajectory of like, let's show people, let's also have trans people and non-binary people in the writing rooms. Yeah. And having showrunners and, straight people, et cetera, listening to them, saying like, okay, what you're saying makes sense. We need to have this. And it's not saying that, the trans experience is ubiquitous for all trans people, but for one person or for 3 people or 5 people to be able to say like, here's my experience, we need to incorporate this, we need to look at this in a different way.
This is something else that I really don't understand, is for filmmakers, writers, directors, when they sit down and they're like, we're going to incorporate this character based on only what I assume is true. And I'm not going to ask anybody to participate in creating this.
Yeah.
I don't, and I never have understood that mindset.
I think it's just a lack of like, you mentioned earlier, not knowing what you not knowing what you don't know. Mm-hmm. That like, it's a lack of understanding. And I have to admit that like my understanding of trans issues has made I've made major leaps forward within like the past 5 years. And some of it's just like, well, no, like I understand this. It's like, well, no, I don't. And it's that willingness, I think, for everybody to be able to say like, I don't know what it's like. Yeah. And if I want to understand the complexity of our society and also put that into art, when you're talking about showrunners and directors and writers, you've got to not necessarily, try, not be like, I'm going to figure this out, but to talk to other people and be willing to get their input and their involvement in it.
Right. Well, and that's what I mean. Like, yeah. I can't imagine sitting down and writing something and like, oh, I'm going to include a trans character in this TV show, for example. I am not trans, so I don't know what that experience is. And I can't imagine just deciding to write that and just basing it on what I've seen in other things instead of saying, oh, you know what? This isn't my area of expertise. I'm going to bring in a trans writer who can also help fill this in and help flesh this out and make this something that feels real and good. I just can't understand not wanting to do that.
Yeah, I do think it's just ignorance. And it's also this, we're so used to having these tropes, right? These are the tropes that we rely on. The whole thing that it's discussed in the documentary, the whole thing about like, oh, a straight man kisses a trans woman and then discovers that, oh my God, she's a man, and starts throwing up. And it becomes something that is like a part of the culture. Like we see it in multiple films. Mm-hmm. It just becomes this thing that runs through everything, and you repeat it without even thinking about it.
Yeah. Although I will say that was one other thing that I think they slightly got wrong when they were talking about Ace Ventura. And one of the people I was talking about, it was like, yeah. And then when it's revealed that she's actually a man, everyone gets sick about it. And I'm like, no, actually, that's a joke about her being super slutty. And they were all throwing up because they'd all made out with her.
Yes, but it's not just, it's both. So wait a minute, it's both transphobic
it's even
and
worse.
misogynist.
Yes.
It's like, it's an even worse thing.
Yeah.
Like when I knew as soon as he brought up Ace Ventura, I was like, oh God, because that was one of my favorite films as a child as well. I am not trans, right? But I was like, and I remember distinctly asking my parents why, because I didn't understand the joke. I was like, why is he throwing up? That doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah.
Like, and my parents, they tried to like, my parents are very progressive. They've like, they were like, well, it's because of this. And the one of the other elements is that my uncle is gay, right? So my only knowledge of gay people was through my uncle. My uncle is normal gay dude. Like, and so the idea about men kissing other men just was like, well, why would you be bothered by that? I don't understand. Right. And so my poor parents having to explain this to a child who does like, how do we explain bigotry to a child that is taking place in one of their favorite films without reinforcing that bigotry, right? And I think we did it pretty well, but it was always one of those things. So as soon as that was brought up, I was like, oh God. Yeah.
The last piece that I do want to bring up before we kind of wrap this discussion up is the fact, and you touched on this too, of how much you have learned and begun to understand in the last 5 years. I certainly have been through that as well. And I think that's one thing that I really appreciated in Disclosure was that they show some very embarrassing footage from, Oprah Winfrey and Katie Couric and very inappropriate questions that they had asked early on their shows, but how that has turned into learning opportunities. And so then like the Oprah clip from, I don't know, 25 years ago, 30 years ago, is then bookended with a clip from now where her conversations are much different and her understanding is much different. And I think showing that growth and showing that people can understand and change their minds and learn. I think it's really important because there have been a lot of conversations where people just get judged, and this is for lots of things, not just LGBTQ issues, but there's a lot of things where people will get things wrong and then they're kind of just judged forever for it. And when we give people space to grow, we encourage them to do so, and it makes it safe for other people to acknowledge their limited understanding and also to want to learn more.
Yeah, it permits you to make errors and to grow as a result of them, and also that encouragement, because if you make a mistake and you immediately get dragged for it, one of the two things that you're going to do is you're either going to entrench yourself in that viewpoint even more,
right,
or you're going to be like, I'm just not going to say anything. And there are some people who do not want to have a conversation. They want to believe the things that they believe, and they will never change their minds about it.
Right.
But facilitating a culture where it's like, it's okay to fuck up and to actually want to be better about it and to want to learn about it more and to understand it more. I personally, for me, like thinking back on some of the opinions, and I know why I held those opinions, specifically about trans people and the trans experience and feminism, etc. I would never say that it veered towards turfiness, but it was getting close. And looking back on it, I'm like, I don't like that. But I actually listened to people, actually had conversations with trans people, primarily online. And it's like, yeah, this makes sense. My opinions are bad and I'm going to revise them. And it's that kind of thing that you have to be allowed to do, and you have to be allowed to grow. And that's particularly also true for celebrities, right? For people like Oprah and Katie Couric who are willing to do better, and are willing to actually listen. And that's important. And so it's like, so yeah, Oprah said some shit that she shouldn't have said and asked questions that she shouldn't have asked, but she learned from that. And there were other people who were willing to extend her that grace. And it's important that she gets extended that grace because she has such a big voice in media. And her having that grace means that she can evolve, and she can also help the culture to evolve.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and watching these kinds of documentaries, reading these kinds of stories, talking to individuals, et cetera, and really being like, I never thought of it like that. I need to think of it like that. I need to consider it more, and being willing to open yourself up to that.
Yes, absolutely. All right. Well, I think that's about it. Paris is Burning is available on Criterion and also on Max. It's also in the Criterion collection, so you can buy it too. And Disclosure is available on Netflix. And where was The Times of Harvey Milk?
The Times of Harvey Milk is on Criterion as well.
Okay, perfect. There you go.
Yeah.
So if you have not seen any of those films, definitely give them a watch. So
the Times of Harvey Milk will make you cry, I have to say. Like
yeah.
It's a good film. It's a very good film. But if you know what happened to him and everything that there's a whole bunch of stuff that I just didn't know in terms of the history of it. But it'll make you mad and it'll make you cry, but it'll also give you hope.
Which is all the things that you want in a good film.
Sure.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for listening and participating with us today. We especially want to thank our patrons. They are Abby, Ollie, Brian, Connor, Estefania, Heather, James, Judy, Carriotta, Matt, Michelle, Monty, Nanina, Robert, Steve, Sharon, and Tao. And I just have to say, again, I've brought her up a couple times, but Abby, I just love your messages on our Patreon. We don't always respond to them, but they're always so good. So thank you so much for that. Yeah, Abby's the best. And if you would like to become a patron too and support the show and help keep this ad-free and in the world, go to patreon.com/citizendame and subscribe. We also have our Ko-Fi, ko-fi.com/citizendame, and our Etsy shop, etsy.com/shop/citizendamepod. You can reach out to us lots of different ways. On email, we are citizendamepod@gmail.com, and our website is citizendamepod.com. And we're pretty consistent there, right? With all the naming. Anyway, we're also on social media. So technically, we're still on Twitter. We're definitely still on Instagram @CitizenDamePod. And then our letterbox, we are a Letterboxd HQ @CitizenDame. And of course, you can reach out to us individually. Lauren, where are you?
I am on Instagram and Letterboxd @LHBusiness.
And I am on all the socials @Karen M. Peterson. Thank you all so much for listening, and we will catch you next time.
Bye.
Why don't you be frank with us? What exactly is it that you're trying to say?
I'm no dummy. I work in the city, and I know a man pretending to be a woman when I see one, and I see 3 right in front of me. This is not that kind of establishment.
Wait a minute. Girl.
God may have blessed you with Barbies, a backyard with a pony in it, a boyfriend named Jake, and an unwanted pregnancy that your father paid to terminate so you could go to college and major in being a basic bitch. None of these things make you a woman.
Clear your throat. Lubricate. Now read that bitch.
Your uniform of ill-fitting J. Crew culottes, fake pearls, and 50-cent scrunchies cannot conceal the fact that you do not know who you are. I know our presence threatens you. We fought for our place at this table, and that has made us stronger than you will ever be.